Hey guys, Sean here. Welcome to the F1 Word and to the Mexican Grand Prix debrief. Now, I've been pondering how I felt about that race, and it wasn't until I came to try and rate the race that I decided, for me at least, it fell somewhere between good and average. It was another one of those races that was very much dominated by strategy. It was tense, and it looked as though we were in for what Murray Walker would have called a barnstorming finish. However, that big dramatic end never happened, and I think that kind of left a lot of people feeling it was a bit of an anticlimax. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't a bad race by any stretch of the imagination, it just never delivered on that promise, or I guess its potential. It did, though, throw up a few talking points, and I'll go over some of those a little bit later in the video. But first, let's start, as we always do, by having a look at that final race result. Lewis Hamilton took the win in Mexico, 1.7 seconds clear of Sebastian Vettel in the Ferrari, with teammate Valtteri Bottas rounding off the podium. Charles Leclerc was fourth with 6.3 seconds covering the top four. And then we have the Red Bulls of Alex Albon and Max Verstappen finishing fifth and sixth. Sergio Perez was seventh, another properly good drive, and did a great job to keep Ricciardo at bay towards the end of the race. And when you consider that Checo pitted on lap 20 and ran the final 51 laps on the hard tyres, and Ricciardo was on the mediums for 21 laps at the end, the quicker tyre and much fresher as well, it was another really good result for Perez. Ricciardo in 8th did try what he called an optimistic move into turn 1, but went in too deep, locked up, and that was pretty much it, although he did put on another charge towards the end. As you can see there, he was pretty close to that 7th place. By the way, Perez couldn't help but tease Danny Rick post-race by saying that the Aussie needed a Red Bull to get that move done. Very cheeky, Checo. Pierre Gasly was bumped up to 9th after the race, more on that later, and it was a really solid drive from him as well, given how ill he had been over the course of the weekend. But he's got his teammate to thank for picking up the points, because he did initially cross the line in 11th place. Pierre also had a great scrap with Carlos Sainz, by the way, at the midway point of the race. I really enjoyed that, with the Frenchman pulling off a very solid move to come out on top. Nico Hulkenberg was classified in 10th place, taking that final point for Renault, with Daniil Kvyat in 11th, but more on them two a little bit later on in the video. Lance Stroll finished 12th with Carlos Sainz in 13th in what was a really weird race for the Spaniard. He was looking so good for a big haul of points, running right towards the front after his start, and he looked as though he was on for being comfortably best of the rest, maybe even as high as 6th. But in the second stint, all of his pace just completely disappeared. I was at a loss yesterday as to why, but Carlos has since said in his post-race interviews that as soon as he put the hard tyre on, he had absolutely no grip, which left the car sliding around, and that forced him into a second stop to get rid of them. So massively disappointing for McLaren and for Carlos as well, after what was looking like a very promising race. Antonio Giovinazzi was 14th, and he was one of a number of drivers who had issues at their pit stops. His mechanics hadn't finished putting his right rear on when he was dropped from the jacks, and that all cost him 20 plus seconds according to the team, as of course they then had to put him up on the jacks again and then put the wheel on properly. Kevin Magnussen was 15th in the leading Haas, but that doesn't say too much really. What the hell is going on with that team? As I said last night though, if they don't know, we're not going to know. His race was compromised at the start after contact with Kimi Raikkonen causing floor damage, and K-Mag actually felt that all things considered, he and the team did the best they could. George Russell, he finishes 16th place and had a properly good fight with teammate Robert Kubica at one point. Some real wheel-to-wheel action between the two of them, and they were about as close as they could get to each other without taking each other out. Great stuff, a lot of respect, and I really enjoyed seeing that. But also, Williams beat Grosjean on pure pace. They did not fluke that result. And had Kubica not needed to make a second pit stop because of a slow puncture, he would probably have beaten his teammate and would have been ahead of Grosjean himself. And yes, I know we are only talking about what could have been 16th and 17th place, but that is a big result for Williams. On Grosjean, by the way, he finished 17th and said in his post-race interviews that the car just wasn't working well, and it had felt that way since FP3. Hopefully for Haas's sake, they can have a better weekend in Austin, their home Grand Prix of course. Your retirements, Kimi Raikkonen, he had to retire due to his cooling being damaged, which obviously caused his car to overheat late on. And Lando Norris, whose race was pretty much over after his first pit stop thanks to a cross-threaded wheel nut. I'm sure you'll remember, but the team released him, but were not sure if the wheel was correctly attached, and so they felt they had to ask him to stop. They wheeled him back to the pit box to make sure everything was okay and then sent him on his way again. But with no safety car or anything like that, that was pretty much it for him. He was on his own at the back, and so eventually retired to save his car. Also, super quickly on that one, the stewards did investigate McLaren for an unsafe release, but surprisingly took no further action. Not often you see that with unsafe releases. Basically, as it turns out, they didn't have any evidence to determine if that car was actually released in an unsafe condition, because the team themselves had even said they weren't sure. All of that means that Lewis Hamilton did not wrap up the title in Mexico, but he can do next time out in Austin. He is now 74 points clear of teammate Valtteri Bottas, with a maximum of 78 points still available. Charles Leclerc is sitting third still on 236 points, now just 6 clear of his teammate Sebastian Vettel, who moves up into fourth, with Max Verstappen dropping to fifth on 220. Pierre Gasly has made his way back to the top of that little fight in the midfield on 77 points, with Carlos Sainz 7th on 76, Alex Albon 8th on 74, wow is it close, and then we've got Sergio Perez on 43 and Daniil Ricciardo rounding out the top 10 on 38. In the Constructors' Championship, Mercedes, as we already know, are champions, 652 points at the moment, with Ferrari second on 466 and Red Bull third on 341. Despite their disappointing end to the weekend, McLaren are still pretty solidly in fourth place on 111 points, with Renault making up some ground now on 73 points and Toro Rosso on 64, matched by Racing Point, also obviously on 64 points. Alfa Romeo are still 8th on 35 points, Haas are 9th on 28, and Williams are of course still in 10th place with just 1 point on the board. So as touched on earlier, it was very much all about strategy at the front. Before the race, Pirelli were talking about a 2 or maybe even a 3-stop strategy due to possible high tyre degradation. However, the top 3 all managed to make a 1-stopper work. Lewis Hamilton, to be fair, wasn't too sure it was going to work, and he did raise those concerns over team radio, but he needn't have worried, as he was never really challenged once he got out front. He managed the pace well, looked after his tyres, and took a very well-deserved win at a track where Mercedes were not expecting to challenge at all. So a big win for them. Sebastian Vettel ran much longer into that first stint than Lewis Hamilton did, and it looked as though he would be able to close that gap down and take the fight to him on the fresher tyres, but it never really happened. And this is the anticlimax I mentioned at the start of the video. Seb and Bottas were both on much fresher tyres, and Charles Leclerc, who Ferrari committed to a 2-stopper very early on, was also looking seriously good on his tyres. But the gaps just never really closed enough. I mean, after his second stop, which by the way was a slow 6.4 seconds, thanks to problems getting a wheel on, but Leclerc was quick and consistently taking 1 or 2 seconds a lap out of the race leader. It looked at one point as though that was Leclerc's win for the taking. But as it turned out, no. And according to Leclerc, as soon as he got near the car ahead, everything started to overheat, and so he was unable to get close enough to get a move done. And that's something as well that we discussed last night for quite a while actually. But the dirty air was a huge factor in Mexico, and as soon as the cars were getting somewhere around 2 seconds I think off the car ahead, they were starting to struggle. And the high altitude played a big part in that too, as it did with the cooling of the cars. Look at me pretending I know what I'm talking about, I totally just read that from a press release. But it was one of the factors that cost us a potentially great finish. Alex Albon was also part of that fight at the front during his first stint anyway, and I did wonder if he might be able to bring himself into play towards the end, because like Leclerc, his pace after his second stop was very strong. Could you imagine just how good it would have been if the top 6 were all fighting for the win in the last 5 laps or so? Such a shame. But anyway, Albon did say post-race that the 1-stopper probably wouldn't have worked for them because he didn't feel that they would have had the pace or the tyre life to compete. He did also lose a fair bit of time in traffic as well, didn't he, after that first stop? Initially, it appeared as though he had got out in front of Carlos Sainz, but the McLaren just had the momentum on that straight and went past him. I have to say, though, all in all, another really good and another consistent drive from Alex Albon. I was properly impressed with him yesterday, even though he didn't manage to get anywhere near that podium in the end. He still raced well. Moving on from strategy, because like I say, I discussed it with Chain Bear for a big chunk of last night's race reaction stream, so at this point I'm really just going to be repeating myself. But there were a few incidents during the race that I do just want to run through very quickly, and I say very quickly, you know what will happen, I'll waffle for ages. But here we go. At the very start of the race, Lewis Hamilton got away well and was challenging the Ferraris on the run down to turn 1. However, as he went to try and make a move down the outside of Vettel, the German put a bit of a squeeze on him, bit of an understatement there, and left the Mercedes just on the grass. The stewards did note it, but decided to take no further action in the end, and to be honest, it was a little bit cheeky from Seb, and he was right on the line, but that is what these drivers are there to do, push it right to the limit, just not go over it. So I don't think that warrants a penalty of any kind. Now that one's out of the way, it's on to Max Verstappen, and he was involved in a few incidents actually during the race. 2 of them involving a Merc and contact. He went for a move on Hamilton up the inside of turn 1 at the start, but his back end stepped out, and he just clipped the Mercedes, causing damage to Hamilton's floor, which I should mention at this point, Lewis said post-race had made his race a struggle. But Hamilton also had his own moment and tapped Verstappen's front left as they went into turn 2 and both had to take to the grass to avoid any further contact. And by the way, actually, while we're talking about the first lap, just a couple of corners later, Vettel also tagged the back of Leclerc, but no damage was done on that one. On the Verstappen and Hamilton first lap incident, for me, that is a first lap racing incident all day long. I said it last night, there's got to be some leniency on the first lap to a point because you've got 20 cars all going into one corner pretty much at the same time. There's going to be some contact. That wasn't it though for Max. He went for a really aggressive late but awesome move up the inside of turn 13 in the stadium, and it did look at that point as though he was on his way back. But Bottas turned in, probably not expecting Max to be there actually, and that ended up with the Red Bull's rear tyre touching the Merc's front wing and left Verstappen with a puncture. Again, no penalty needed in my view for either driver. It was a shame though that Max got that puncture, because I genuinely do believe that he would have been right in the fight had he continued with no issues from there. There was actually a third round of contact for Max Verstappen as he came up against Kevin Magnussen. He had a look up the inside of the Haas in turn 4, Magnussen turned in and the two touched. And actually, I've paused the replay right now and I'm looking at it again. It wasn't really ever on for Max and perhaps he should have been a bit more patient. I know he needed to go aggressive to make up ground, but he's not exactly alongside K-Mag at that point. He did, though, get the move done on the outside of turn 5 and off track, it must be said. But again, the stewards looked into it and took no further action. But I have got to say, Max did a brilliant job to end up P6 come the checkered flag. He pitted on lap 5 because of that puncture, obviously, and ran to the end on one set of hard tyres. That is 66 laps. And his pace throughout was consistent and pretty quick as well. He never really dropped off that much in that stint, if at all. And all things considered, it was a pretty good Sunday in the end for Max. It could have been a lot worse than P6 given where he was after that early pit stop. I still can't believe he got those tyres to the end. I was adamant in the race watch-along that he was going to have to stop again. Oh, and for what it's worth, he also won Driver of the Day, obviously. The final incident I want to cover is the one very late on between Daniil Kvyat and Nico Hulkenberg. I say very late on. It was actually their last lap of the race. It all happened in the final corner, a place where we rarely see overtakes made. In fact, I can't think off the top of my head of anyone making a move through there. Do let me know in the comments if you can think of any, but it's definitely not an orthodox overtaking spot. But Kvyat went for a move up the inside of Nico nevertheless, who, it must be said, did seem to be driving quite slowly at that point, and Hulkenberg said himself post-race that he was struggling with his tyres and had no grip, so that would explain that one. Anyway, back to the point. Kvyat clipped Nico, which put the Renault into a half spin, travelling backwards into the wall. That took off the German's rear wing, although as you saw when I ran through the results earlier, he was still classified and was promoted to 10th after Kvyat was slapped with a 10-second time penalty. A penalty that he says he disagrees with, and I will read his quote here. "I'm quite upset with the penalty I received because as a racing driver, I disagree with it because we are told we are allowed to race." I get that to a point, but he did stick a wheel up the inside of Hulkenberg, and although the Renault was struggling on his tyres, that move was just not ever going to come off. He's also pitched him into a spin, caused damage, and knocked Hulkenberg out of the points. Obviously, that's pre-penalty, so I actually do think that penalty was pretty fair. It was just a bit of a clumsy move from Kvyat, and ultimately it cost him a points finish. As I said earlier, though, it worked out quite nicely for teammate Gasly, didn't it? I know I've said this a few times already, but it was another one of those races where strategy was key, and although that did throw up the potential of an epic finish, it never really materialised, and I was left feeling a little bit deflated. Again, I don't think it was a bad race at all, it just never delivered on its promise. And seeing as I've used the words epic and finish, what about that podium? I am not going to lie, it was a little bit cringe, but not necessarily in a bad way. It just added a bit of a show to the standard podium procedure, which does get a bit stale over the course of a 21 race season, and I'd be more than happy to see that again at other races in the future. The car on the podium was great, and the drivers all seem to agree on that point, but there was one part of the ceremony that Seb didn't enjoy, and that was Selfie Guy. Oh, and the trophies, he didn't like them either. Anyway, Austin next for the US Grand Prix, and that all kicks off again in just a few days' time. Yes, it is race week again already. That is it then for this video, but as is always the case with these debriefs, there is a poll at the top right of the screen where you can rate the race. And you can also let me know your thoughts on the weekend as a whole down in the comment section. And by the way, apologies for any issues with the audio or my voice today. I'm coming down with a bit of a cold. Oh, boo-hoo, I know. But I was determined to get this out today. Now, I will be back soon with more content as ever, but in the meantime, don't forget that you can, of course, follow me over on social media, and all of the links you need for that are in the description down below. But as ever, thank you for watching. I've been Sean, this has been the F1 Word, and until next time, goodbye.